Welcome, everybody. My name is Michael King. This is an inspirational interview with Artful Minds. Today's discussion is with Jill Carver, and I'm just going to read a quick bio of Jill. Jill's work explores the interplay between abstraction and realism, embracing the tension between the two. By focusing on abstract shapes and colors over content, she eliminates certain elements and exaggerates others to achieve her vision. She delights in turning the ordinary into iconic images that celebrate nature and challenges viewers to observe the surroundings more deeply. Welcome, Jill. Thank you very much for doing this interview. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael, for having me. And hello to everybody. Thank you for joining us in your lunch hour.
I'm going to scroll through about, I don't know, a dozen or so of your images. And if
Okay.
you could just talk about your art journey briefly while I do that, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. So I currently live in Southwest Colorado in a tiny little town at 9,000 feet elevation, a population of 280 people. And previously I lived in Austin, Texas, and then before that in London. And I'm from the UK. I'm from England originally. I've been in the States for 22 years now. So yeah, clocking up the decades, which is kind of scary. In London, I had a former career for 11 years as a curatorial research assistant at the National Portrait Gallery there in central London. Prior to that, I was an artist in residence at a Quaker school in York, the medieval city of York, up in the north of England. And prior to that, I was an undergraduate studying British history at Sheffield University. So yeah, I've kind of come into this through a slightly circuitous route, but I've always painted and drawn ever since I was a little kid. It's just something that I have always done. So yeah, here I am, X number of years later.
That's perfect. Match the timing of the slideshow. So let's kind of just jump into it because you're known for your abstraction and really your design, I would say. For those that never painted before, and I understand that you don't really plein air paint for competition at all, maybe for yourself, but painting plein air from life, what can you say about the tangible benefits of those experiences to one's work?
So it's actually how I started out, was working directly outside, initially in watercolor. Actually, when I was at university, that was my medium. And I did actually do the plein air competitions, but quite a long time ago here. But when I moved to the States, the whole plein air movement was just taking off. The plein air magazine had just come out. I think Laguna was up and running, Telluride maybe in its infancy. It was just beginning to take off. You know, when I lived in London for 11 years, I would disappear on the weekends out into the countryside to paint. And it was an escape from work. It was getting out into nature. When I moved to the States and this whole movement was taking off with these competitions, I thought, well, I can do that because my London apartment was never big enough to work inside of. You know, it's like 2 rooms essentially. So yeah, that's kind of how I got my footing and established my reputation in the States. And I probably did them for, I would say, about 8 to 10 years. I did a lot of them, you know, like the circuit, the season of plein air competitions, you know, as well as kind of getting traction career-wise, establishing myself. It was a way to learn a new country. And I think that primarily is my main motivation to get outside, is you're not really going to discover who you are as a painter unless you go direct to source in terms of what you choose to paint, how you choose to paint it. It's just phenomenal. And I always remember those plein air events where you've got 5 artists lined up, all painting the same scene, but the 5 different takes on it. It is such an education as to who you are yourself in terms of your own choices, but also witnessing how different other artists can be. So to me, it's the source of everything. I don't do as much of it now as I would like. And those trips tend to be constructed around, you know, ideas for shows, you know. So I just had a solo show in March this year with Mark Sublet at the Medicine Man Gallery on Grand Canyon, and that involved 3 painting trips there. So yeah, in an ideal world, when I retire, I'd just like to wander without any, you know, sense of obligation or intention behind it and just paint. But it's the source of everything. I think it's the only way that you learn how things are truly put together, you know?
Yeah, that's a strong statement, without a doubt, for sure. Just so everyone knows, you can find Jill Carver at jillcarver.com and Instagram, of course. She has her handle, which is Jill Carver Paintings. Now, the big question, huge question, and it might take up the whole interview, I don't know, but harmony.
Harmony.
Yes. So I'm going to read what I've written because it says it the best, really. We always hear about harmony, mainly around color, but no one ever really quantifies what makes harmony. Sure, artists talk about limited palettes and color strategies, but now I find it really is not the answer. It feels more like a distraction. And so, what is your perception of harmony in painting?
It's like the magic word, isn't it? It's the whole holy grail. And I always used to start off my workshops with, what makes a good painting? And you end up with this long list of things that need to be considered, and it's very overwhelming. And if you had to say what makes a good painting in one word, I think the one word I would choose is harmony, you know? And then it's like, well, what do we mean by harmony and what are we referring to? And I've spent a lot of time the last few years trying to get this down into words succinctly from my own standpoint, because I have a broad appreciation for a whole range of styles. And a lot of the time we get caught up in the discussion of how much detail is added or left out. And I think because of my background in London and exposure to a whole range of art, I've always been intrigued with what's the common denominators that make something aesthetically pleasing, regardless of style, whether you're highly photorealistic or whether you're more abstracted. And I had to come up with this introduction to my video. So I actually put the pressure on myself, sum this up in one paragraph or even one sentence. So here we go. To me, what makes a good painting? Harmony. What do we mean by that? I think what we mean by that is a balance between unity and variety. In what? In three ingredients: shape, value, color. When you think about other words that suggest harmony, what are we referring to there? We're thinking about similarities. We're thinking about maybe connections. We're thinking about establishing a rhythm through repeating similar things, and those things are shape, value, color. What do we mean by variety? Well, the emphasis there is on differences. So I always think of painting as having, the flour, eggs, and water components are shape, value, and color. And then you want to think about unity and variety within each of those, but also between them. And that's really how I've come round to this way of thinking and of teaching now. Nature provides the variety, right? And that's where we get into trouble, because we end up chasing too much variety. And there's a great British teacher called Bernard Dunstan, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but he says if you have too much variety in a painting, it starts to be quite a harsh visual experience. It starts breaking up into too much information. It overloads the eye and the visual experience. If you have too much unity, it's kind of boring, right? So it's that delicate balance. So to achieve harmony in a painting, it's getting a delicate balance between unity and variety in those three ingredients: shape, value, and color. I think of nature providing the variety and too much of it. So it's really our job as artists to find unity. Where are we going to find the unity? And it's really interesting because when I teach, I don't care how people are painting. I don't teach process. I don't teach method. But I want them to start having a conversation with themselves, with a scene. And if you break it down, let's start with shape. Where are you finding unity in shape? Do you have one shape that connects the left-hand side of the canvas to the right-hand side? Do you have one shape that establishes unity because it repeats itself? And then we move into value, and then we move into color. So that's my answer, that harmony is a beautiful balance between unity and variety in what? In shape, in value, and in color.
Yeah, it's interesting because it says so little, but it says so much too, doesn't it?
Right,
And it speaks more to just color strategies of harmony, and which I really like because it really encompasses the whole instead of just kind of one issue.
Right. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And shape is often, in my video, I talk about shape a lot. I give it a whole chapter because we tend to talk about finding harmony or designing or editing within value and within color, and shape often gets overlooked. And it's actually where I try and get people to start without thinking about color harmonies or finding values, a
Yeah.
value range or chord
Yeah. So
for
you put shape above value and color, I
yeah.
guess, in a sense, and then it kind of goes what shape, value, and then color because
Yeah, I think
yeah.
so. Yeah.
Okay.
I have some illustrations in my video, and I do this in workshops where I kind of get back to the idea of just contour drawing, the outline of a shape. And for me, a shape is defined by a change in color, not a change in value. A lot of people teach it as a change in value, but I take a slightly broader perspective because, for instance, you might have a row of full cottonwood trees that are exactly the same value as the sky. Here in Colorado, it happens quite a lot, or a mountain range. So you still want to concentrate on drawing the difference between those two shapes, right? So for me, a shape is defined by changing color.
Yeah. Okay. So, but when you mean color, you're more thinking of hue, really, right?
No, I'm just thinking of color, which
Oh, interesting.
so has three ingredients, which is hue, chroma, and value,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay.
I think so value is a subcomponent of color.
Yeah, for sure.
I love getting people just going back to the contour drawings, which if you think of when we're kids, that's kind of how we start, right? It's how we start visualizing the world. If someone says draw a dinosaur, right? We draw the outline. And it's tapping into that. And I show how shape can trump both value shifts and it can trump the color rules too. For instance, and it's normally a light bulb moment that we realize that we've kind of given up all this knowledge of what shape can do. But if you think of being taught, drummed into that warm colors advance and cool colors
Hmm.
recede, well, by simply having a purple square overlap a yellow square, simply by overlapping that, suddenly the purple advances and the yellow recedes. And it's like, oh my gosh, shape is a very powerful thing. And in itself, it can kind of bend the value rules and the color rules.
Yeah, interesting. All right. So here's a question for you then. It just popped in. Like if you have, say, a grove of trees, it's partly in shadow, but then the tops of the trees are sunlit. Would you consider the base of the trees a different shape compared to the sunlit tops of the trees?
Oh.
Or is that too refined?
No, this comes back to it depends on what you're wanting to achieve in the painting. So often these questions I answer with, well, it depends what the question in your head is. Is it important to the concept of your painting that the base of those trees are depicted differently to the tops of the trees? So it kind of depends on the context, I would say.
All right, all right. I want to share this piece of yours, and we can talk about it a little bit. We have a lot of shades, but we have this strong color, which is the vibrant orange.
Mm.
But it seems to win over the strong yellow that you have, but it subsides over this kind of ochre color you have. So when you think about shapes and the design of your paintings, are you intentionally trying to also guide the viewer through your paintings to what you consider the focal point or focal area, if you think that way?
Yeah, I don't really think in terms of focal areas. I think in terms of concept and what I want to, I think in terms of focal point as telling the viewer the story of what I'm most excited about. Okay. I don't necessarily think about it as a literal kind of here's a pathway in and here's the focal point. It's interesting to me on this study that you pick up on the orange in the background because I'm a little bit of a geek, a masochistic geek, I would say. And so the drive behind my excitement in this instance were the colors reflected in the water, even though it's in a shadow plane. It tells a story of what's going on elsewhere. It's really, there's this balance, right, between an interesting shape in that stream with a high value contrast right? That is eye-catching. And to me, that's where I end up. And to me, that orange wall behind is a secondary stopping point. So if you were to say, where do you end up? I would say I end up in that stream looking at the reflections. And that's partly because there's a big value contrast there. It's partly because it's a very interesting shape. And then I see that orange wall as a secondary tier of conversation, put it that way.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that here. I want to bring something up here that I should have brought up before. All right, so here we have the scene again, but I did create a black and white because I found this really fascinating in terms that although that orange is quite chromatic, very chromatic in the sense, you're
Yes.
correct in that you have a lot more contrast with the stream than you do anywhere else.
Right. And the
Yeah.
stream reflecting the sky ends up being our lightest light, even though it's in the shadow plane. And that's another masochistic conversation I've always had with myself is, can you create a final area of interest within a shadow plane rather than within the light? It's like one of those rule breaking things. It's easier to create a final focal area or final interest within a lit area rather than the shadow, but it still ends up being our lightest light because even though it's in a shadow plane, it's reflecting the sky.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I find that quite fascinating, and I guess a lesson for many that just because the color is high chromatic doesn't necessarily mean the value is high, right?
No, right? So, and it is this balance between, we're always taught that focal areas have the highest value contrast, but I love that play, that kind of tension, counterweighted tension that you can set up where you go, well, if I have a high value contrast here, but those colors are fairly neutral, and I put an orange next to a blue-green over here, what's winning? I mean, I love conversations like that within painting.
Oh yeah, you can see it a lot within your work, I think, as well, for sure. Now, before we move on, do you want to show the DVD and tell people where they can find it?
This is a relatively new, came out this year. I'm losing track of where we are in the year. Came out kind of June, July-ish. Streamline Publishing, PaintTube TV, and you can do it as a DVD or a download. What I do want to point out is Streamline Publishing are really pushing this, the Ultimate Collection, which is actually 2 DVDs in one packet. And it's got a relatively high price point because of the size of it and the length of it. But I want people to know that they can just buy the theory component in volume 1. It's a lot cheaper, and that would be the equivalent of the theory of a 5-day design workshop that I do. It's chock-a-block full with goodies, but it essentially replicates the content of the design workshops I've been doing the last 5 years.
Nice. That's good to know. Thank you for that. And with that, I want to jump into a painting of yours called Desert Congregation that has recently been on the cover of Plein Air magazine. But I want to jump into the notan that you published, or your quick sketch, black and white sketch that you posted on Instagram of the painting before we move into the painting, because I think it's a good transition into shapes. And obviously there's a lot of shapes in this painting, but can you just walk us through what you're thinking when you're creating this sketch?
Yeah. So you can see, I hope you can see on this, it's just one of several sketches I did in my sketchbook. And I actually found it so I can show you 2 other alternative sketches as well. But this was the one that ended up jumping to the final painting. And the idea was, my concept behind the painting, so I don't paint scenes, I paint concepts. What I'm excited by was that clearly this soil had either been stricken by drought or had been tilled or overgrazed at some point, and there were all these little sage bushes, but of the same age. They were relatively young and small, and they seemed to be equally spaced, and they just had this lovely sensation of being this congregation or a marching army of some kind on this beautiful saturated desert soil. It had rained the night before, so this is the morning moisture kind of burning off essentially. And it was, if you're dealing with an element of multiple repeating bushes, trees, how do you organize them to get the viewer from the foreground into the back where the light and the drama is happening? And it just shows a very simple use of some linear perspective to get you back to the horizon line. There are ways of organizing them. And then when you switch to the painting, you don't really get a feel. I can see it. I can see how they've been arranged. but you don't feel like it's particularly strongly orchestrated. But I tell you, that makes for a stronger looking painting than were you just to scatter them randomly across. Very useful too if you're dealing with a forest and you're thinking about, where do I place the base of all these, like an aspen grove, right, in relatively flat ground? Where do I place the base of all those trees to get you back and through into the forest? It's a very kind of easy armature structure that really helps a lot, I think.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You never really think about composition in a sense. You think about the design of all the elements for the concept of the piece.
So what's your definition of composition,
Well, yeah,
Michael?
that's the thing, right? I mean,
So I think of composition, orchestration, design as being interchangeable words. Are you defining it differently?
no, you always hear about composition in terms of, you got your structures, you have your linear line structures or your guiding lines like you do with farm fields or wineries. You have your L shape, you have your O shape, you have your S shape.
Hmm.
Those are kind of what people throw around as composition. I'm quite tired of it. So that's why I want to think that you don't really think about those things when you develop your painting. You think more of the concept of the painting in terms of how things are, in a way, directing it.
Right. I always start off with concept, and that's definitely something that has come through in the last 5 years. You start off with concept and then you come up with alternative designs, what if alternatives might suit that concept. And I think of design all the time. I'm obsessed by it. I'm very mathematical. I'm very geeky. I like knowing how things are put together. My husband does the cooking and the cleaning and the laundry, and I do the car mechanics and the plumbing and any electrical work. And the snow blowing and running the chainsaw. I love how things work. So I love the construction. I was asking you that question because I think a lot of composition is about directing the viewer through it, right?
Yes.
Where did they enter the painting and where did they end up? And is that an O? Is it an L? And Edgar Payne is great on that. I think in terms of more kind of modernist terms, in that very aware that here on a canvas, I have 4 hard edges and I have 4 right-angled corners. And visually, that is a lot to deal with, right? It's not like looking out into a landscape where the edges are resolved by soft peripheral vision. You are planning within 4 hard edges and 4 right-angled corners. And to me, and the modernists are really good about thinking this way, in that they would say actually a painting is a decorative panel and should be considered as a 2-dimensional object. Let's get away from obsessing about it being a 3-dimensional visual trick. Let's treat it as a 2-dimensional object. And let's be very mindful, conscious that we are designing within those 4 edges and 4 corners. And I really think that way. That's why on a lot of my prep studies, you'll see me establish the diagonals
Mm.
as well as the thirds or the quarters. I think that last one was in quarters, but the diagonals now are something that I've always done because I want to know where my corners are and I want to know how I can make things relate to those corners so that the corners and the 4 hard edges are not a distraction. They are part of the structure. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, very much so. As
It's like a
it's a fresh way
multitude.
of looking at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to change the way I look at your pieces as well.
And then I think, when I'm doing demos, I'm always aware when I draw my halfway verticals and horizontals followed by my diagonals is ultimately, am I trying to get it to look like a Union Jack because I'm homesick or something? So
Subconsciously, maybe.
it's amazing to me now when I look at other artists' work that I don't think it's taught much, but I even think, what was the book I was looking at the other day? I think it was Carl Runger's. And actually in some of the photographs, you could see that he had established where his diagonals were. Like I think it's overlooked now. And it's really, really important relating to those diagonals.
Yeah, it's quite interesting you say that because I'm just racking my brain about the last time I ever considered the edges beyond trying to lead the viewer in through an edge, right?
Right.
Not containing it.
So when I talk about shape, we mentioned shape earlier. When I do that in my sketchbook, I am really thinking about how those shapes enter and exit the sides, you know? And is there a unifying shape like here that comes left to right, like all the way through? I'm really thinking like that. The painting you just showed, I think your viewers might find it a treat. So this is the one we were just looking at. But I thought I'd show you two other ideas. This is kind of where I really made it be about the sky. But so you can still see my diagonals here. I think this was divided onto thirds by the looks of it, with a really low horizon line. And then there's another fun one, which I'm still tempted to try, where I kind of square off the sage bushes, and then I'm like, well, what happens if I really square off the clouds too?
Oh, that's quite interesting.
You know, we're creating unity through shape language, in that the sage bushes become little rectangles and the clouds become rectangles.
Yeah. That,
So,
that's
yeah.
interesting. You know what, but here, let me jump back to this because I've been really big into directing the viewer in a painting and trying to understand it in my own mind. So you're kind of breaking me a little bit, but that's fine. And I talk about a lot about gradations and how to move through the painting. And you know what, I see it in yours in terms of, this is a little darker orange as it progresses up. It gets to a bit of a little cooler, a little lighter. Same with the
Mm-hmm.
greens, a little warmer, maybe a little cooler, a little more vibrant than the ones below. The cloud starts dark to push you through. So I still see these a lot of these elements, but you're saying you don't really participate in that train of thought. You're more about the concept of let's say the light hitting the back of this mesa, or what am I missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. Everything you've just said is a consideration. But I guess my initial conversation with myself is, for starters, my first question would be, one, what do I want to tell the viewer I'm most excited about? And I think in this instance, there's two possible concepts, right? There's one, which is this merry band of sage bushes, or the two is the other one that I showed you, where the sky becomes the thing I'm most excited about, and that
Yeah,
foreground is then the supporting actor. So one is establishing, well, which concept do I want to chase? And the designs change accordingly, right? So when I went for, well, I like the merry band of marching sage bushes, then the next question is, how much of this square do I give to foreground and how much to sky? Like, where is that line going to be? Part of the feeling of that area that I was painting in was expanse. It was during COVID. I'd started camping again to paint. And there's actually a curve to that horizon line because I wanted to indicate that all of that action is way back there, and there's this expansiveness, almost so that you can feel the curve of the earth. Like, that was totally exaggerated. But that next question would have been, well, if my concept is marching band of sage bushes over and above the action in the sky, then where am I going to draw that horizon line?
gotcha. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Then all the points that you pick up about, gradation and getting the viewer back there, all of that holds true. It just comes at a later point for me.
Yeah, okay. It's not the driving focus. It's really what you
Right.
want to say. And I guess this brings me up to one of the other questions that I had, and it talks about the emotion to the scene. And I guess that is what it was, that vastness, the curvature, and that's really what you wanted to say to it. And everything else is just developed around that, right?
Right. And then the character of all these little bushes that all happen to be the same shape, spaced equally apart, like there's something about that scene that made me chuckle and smile.
That's funny. But can you talk about a little bit about the emotion to the scene and why is it so important?
Yeah, and it's come to me recently, we're all works in progress. I probably started out as a scene painter, right? And I've realized that the strongest paintings to me have a singular intention behind them. And that doesn't mean to say they can't be about a multitude of things, but there's a hierarchy to those things. And that's where editing can really kind of take off in a creative kind of way, as you say, well, this particular piece is going to be about the sky. This particular piece is going to be about celebrating all those little sage bushes. So concept-driven design, I feel, has really improved my own work, is that there's a reason why we all stop the car and hit the brakes and we jump out and we set up and paint, and or there's a reason, there's a specific thing that turned us on, and that we tend to forget that once we start painting, right? And we tend to lose that in the hierarchy. And so what I call scenery paintings have nothing to do with a level of detail. I don't care how much detail people go into, but it's like every element is treated in equal weight, you know? And I think the strongest paintings are where you really get a sense of, well, it was the juxtaposition between this color and that color that really turned this artist on, or it was the shape of this creek that was the big thing. And one of the things I get my students, they bring in photo references. I say, finish the sentence. I took this photo because. It is so hard. It sounds so simple, but we all start listing things, you know? And I say, no. And then I flip it on its head and say, what is the one thing about this that you wouldn't want me to take away? You know, and that's sometimes easy. And they go, oh, you know what? It was the shape of that fence, you know? And it's like, okay. So once you've established that, write it down. And a lot of the artists I really admire, regardless of style, write the concept down on their forehead, on their easel. Like, it's so good to remind yourself.
Yeah.
I was chatting to, I think it was Len Schmiel like a year ago, and I said, do you ever have a painting, like when you get to that level of technical prowess, decades and decades of experience, do you get a painting go wrong? You know? And he says, yes. And it's when I stray from my initial concept, you know? And it sounds very simple thing, and it's actually very hard to do. And that's not to say a painting can't evolve, but if it evolves with the exploration of a concept, it's going to be a lot more successful than if it wanders off into where it's different concepts going on at the same time. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. And now, because you're talking about concept, I just want to bring up this one painting here. I think I understand what the concept is. Really, see, now I automatically go to here, but what I'm thinking now is the concept was this seeing beyond the scene in terms of, much like the other piece, the elements of the sky within the water. Would I be correct? Or
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I really wanted to capture here, and it was this is the Sabino Canyon in Tucson. And I really wanted to capture the vividness of the spring greens, but use the water as a kind of structural support, you know, so that the blue's reflecting. I find so often that the blue of the sky can be such an alien color compared to the landscape and what's going on in it, that it can be quite difficult to deal with. And so when it's repeated in water, just in a different hue version, just seems to unify. There's that beautiful word of finding unity. But it was actually about celebrating those kind of vivid yellow greens that you get in the spring there.
gotcha. Okay.
Palette on this was particularly challenging. I hiked up Sabino Canyon, I think it was 3 days in a row, and just started painting. I don't really kind of go out to produce finished paintings anymore. But if there's an area that attracts me, I don't really think about design anymore. So this is a studio painting based on 3 or 4 field studies where I'll just set up and I'll just start painting and getting whatever color information I can. It was tricky palette-wise to pull off, right? So in areas where we have too much variety in color, given in reality, which is what this place is, it pretty much had every color of the spectrum represented there. So we've got too much variety in the color hues presented. Is how am I going to find the unity? I actually used a limited skewed triad palette for this. to reel it in and to establish unity through limiting the number of pigments I was using.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I could see that the yellow, green, the red, violet, the
And then the other way I established unity, and this was a very conscious decision, was again, there was so much variety in there in terms of object shape, you know, like foliage, water, rocks, grassy stuff, sky, mountains, that I used the same size brush and the same mark making rhythm throughout the whole. And so I established unity, and you see this more when you see it up close through repeated similar mark making, regardless of what it was I was painting, if that makes sense.
yeah, for sure, for
Yeah,
sure.
it was one of those things. It's an attractive scene to be, right? It's a water oasis in the middle of a harsh desert, but there was too much variety in terms of different object surfaces and texture, and too much variety in terms of color. So
Yeah.
in the studio, I was very aware, okay, I need to impose unity on those two elements.
Gotcha, gotcha. Now, when you talk about when you paint outside and you're trying to establish color notes, etc., like that,
Mm.
you're not necessarily talking about matching the colors that you see that nature's providing you? Are you talking more about the relationships between the colors that you want to create?
I, when I'm outside painting now, I am actually trying to put down the colors that I'm seeing accurately.
And then you deal with it later in the main
And
studio
then I
piece.
might make adjustments or alterations later in the studio
Okay.
when I've come up with a concept and what I, really kind of resolve what I want to say. But outside, when I'm working plein air, I really do try and capture the colors that I see. Now, people still say to me, oh, now come now, you're still exaggerating. And I'm like, guilty. That's just me as a human being. I get very excited about color. So am I prone to embellishing them a little bit? Probably am, because that's how I see. I get excited. But
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
my intention now as a plein air painter, not to produce paintings, but to go out there and learn colors. Because I think in the studio, we tend to fall into these go-to formulaic mixtures for dealing with certain things. And outside, I think that's one of the most important things about plein air painting, is that you see colors for the first time that you've never mixed before or never seen before.
Yeah, and how do you actually mix those, right? That's the scary
Right,
part. Yeah, for
right.
sure. This is an interesting question. Does the medium impact the way you approach? I would think probably not, right? You're still looking for your shapes and design.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I would say probably as I am now, no, it wouldn't impact me. In the past, it would have. I started out in watercolor, which is such a different medium and requires more of a perception about where you want to end up, because you're working in reverse,
Yeah.
from lights to darks generally. Whereas now, oil painting, I don't even work darks to lights, in all honesty. I approach it as a mosaic of shapes that connect, like tiling, like a mosaic. So it's just literally coloring in blocks of color. So oil paint, acrylic, gouache would work very well for all of that.
And that brings me to this piece because you said blocks of color. Snakeweed and blue mesa. I find this one fascinating. I mean, the shape of this back distant hill, I think, says it all. I think it's really fascinating. But what I really find interesting about this piece is your darkest dark is actually in the background. And it's, I think I want to show this because it's really important for people to see and understand that just because we learn these rules of atmospheric perspective doesn't mean they necessarily have to apply for your painting. And I went a little bit further and I compared the blue to the kind of
Oh, look at, yeah,
sienna of the
yeah,
sagebrush, and those are
yeah,
equal values. I
they
mean, they're
are.
very
Yeah,
close. So in a
right.
sense, I mean, you could argue, oh, you're flattening the perspective of space because you have such a dark mountain. But and on all honesty, you really haven't. We still have this vast distance
Right.
within this space, right?
Right. And those little dark accents in the foreground, I probably would have had the conscious thought, well, that distant mesa in a cloud shadow, I need to find not necessarily a value darker than that in the foreground, but a value at least as dark in the foreground, was probably a thought there.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, it was very intentional in a sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's where it may well have been that out there in that situation that the foreground, there's so much reflected light around there that there's very, very few darks in that foreground because of the amount of light. And snakeweed is, there's a lot of light passing through it. It's not a very solid plant, but that's where through experience, you're having this thought, well, it's not my duty to paint it as it is. It's my duty to paint a painting that works to the viewer because, I'm closing it off with these four hard edges. Therefore, it has to make sense.
Yeah, yeah. In a sense, don't paint the scene. I guess paint for the sake of the painting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I find this is an interesting question just because a lot of people work from photos. There's nothing like working for life to get you to understand what photos say, but would you take the same photo of the scene you're painting at different times of day and refer back to them while you're in the studio to do adjustments?
Yes, different times of day, not so much. When I'm taking photos, particularly so many of us, I know I am, we're kind of resorting to iPhones right now because it's such an easy tool to use. But the thing that I'm very, very aware of is they do embellish contrast. They bump up contrast and they make shadows bluer and grayer than they are. So I tend to, I still take a little Canon camera with me. Like when I went to the Grand Canyon, I was very aware that all my iPhone photos were turning all those shadows blue-gray, and I was seeing them a lot warmer still than they were. At most, they were a brown-violet, they were not a blue-gray. And so different times of day, maybe yes, to get different structural information if I want different patterns, different light and shadow patterns. But when I'm working with a camera, more than anything, I will expose on the lit areas and then take a second set exposing on the shadow areas. Because the biggest problem you're going to get working from a photo is that it makes the shadows appear a lot darker and colder than they were in reality, and it eliminates reflected light. So I tend to do two exposures, one on the lit area and one on the shadow area.
That's fantastic advice. I think that's one of the best pieces of advice for reference photography for any painter, without a
Yeah,
doubt.
it's a
That will
dangerous
explode.
thing. I think you get better using photographs the more experienced you are. The other thing I do is I take notes in my sketchbook, and I'll take one of those little 1 to 10 value scales with me. And because I know both my phone and my camera are going to up the contrast, and I have found that my reading of what the value of a shadow plane is in reality versus a photographic record of it, it's at least 2 values out. That's huge. It's
Oh,
2 values wrong, 1.5 to 2 values wrong. So now I will actually take notes and say, looking at this visually, I think that shadow plane's, a value 4 or something like that. Like write it down, from life.
yeah, that's huge, right?
Yeah.
That's huge. And unfortunately, everyone gets trapped into that.
Right.
Most
Right.
people do, right? Yeah, for sure. One of the things because I had to study a lot of your paintings, I kept on seeing a recurring theme, really, in that your values, you don't really, I mean, arguably, maybe you get into 5 with the little small details and stuff like that, or perception of details, but really you have a strong structure of 3 or 4 values, which I find really interesting, just because your pieces are always strong. So I just want to share a few works with you. There, with this piece here, we look at this and we see quite a few values when we perceive it as color, but in reality, we might be talking 3 values in total. Look, I mean, considering how dark the sky is, it's almost the same value as the bush,
Yeah.
etc. Now, do you find following a 3-4 value structure really helps make a painting more impactful?
Well, it's interesting you picked out this example. I confess when I painted this, I was not paying any attention to values at all. But I do know from living in an area that has a lot of this full color, and again, this might be a handy tip for viewers, is there's a tendency to paint full aspen or full cottonwoods lighter than they actually are. And if you want this really kind of, it's not so much how light they are, it's how chromatic and saturated that color is. That's really the essence of what you want to capture. And it's a lot lower in value than you think it might be. There's a tendency there when we see yellows and oranges to go too high key, add too much white, and then you end up with this chalkiness. And then you don't get the feeling of saturation, which is actually what's happening, particularly when they're semi-backlit, as in this instance.
Absolutely. So does that mean you have higher key colors on your palette, like in yellows, or do you stick with the CADs?
I have CAD yellows. I tried the Hansa yellows and I just didn't like them. I still go back to my cadmiums. I love gold ochre.
Okay, for
And
sure.
so here's the thing, right? A standard palette for me outdoors, my lightest yellow would normally be a CAD yellow light. When I'm painting full foliage in the studio, I know that going as light as CAD yellow light is going to make it too chalky. So I actually remove my CAD lemons and my CAD yellow lights from my palette. And my lightest yellow is a CAD yellow deep. And that's as light as your yellow full foliage and sunlight needs to be. It's
That's
CAD yellow
fascinating.
deep. I'm giving away all my secrets now. And for
Thank you
your
for that.
shadows, get that gold ochre there. It is just
Yeah.
dynamite. Gold ochre for the shadows, CAD yellow deep is as light as you need to go.
Yeah. I guess because people are perceptually interchanging chroma with value in a sense, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, they get very confused by
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I'll bring up this one that we looked at the beginning with the high chroma,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And again, you look at this in black and white, 1, 2, 3,
Yeah.
arguably 5, but probably 4 strong
Right.
values.
Right. And there you get this instance. In fact, I've got another painting on the go now where, okay, that orange wall in the distance is in sunlight, but then you've got this kind of salty deposit sand in shadow that's reflecting a lot of sky. Now, normally we're told to separate those values because one's in light and one's in shadow. And here's the other masochistic part of me that's going, oh, but if you have something, that's orange and it's way back there, it could potentially be the same value as something very light in shadow in the foreground that's got a lot of reflected light on it. So I love things there where some of these value rules start falling apart,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. That's great.
You talk about, so I don't necessarily do a value plan for every painting, and I explain this in my video, but there are certain instances where I will impose a value plan, either to embellish my concept or to troubleshoot potential pitfalls with a piece. And it's probably the strongest chapter in my video thing is using, people talk about editing, what's in reality and reducing them to 3 or 4 values to establish unity, right? That ability, it's a very good ability. You can also design using values. And in my video, I show that actually you can manipulate your value. Once you've identified those values in reality, whether it's 3 or 5, you can actually start manipulating them. Why would you do that? Well, to embellish your concept and to create unity. For instance, if you did have a situation where in reality there was a multitude of a lot of different hue families represented, how can you include all of those hue families without it giving you eyeball ache? Well, if you establish a value plan and pull like 4 different hues into one value, you create this underlying unity there, but the viewer is not necessarily aware that they're being manipulated like that.
Yeah.
And in the video, I show, if we talk about harmony, unity, and variety, in the video, I show that I think if you think of those 3 ingredients, shape, value, color, and which ones you're going to claim unity through and which ones you're going to celebrate in variety. If you were to reduce a scene, this is my argument in my video, if you create unity through, say, reducing a scene that has 12 value shifts in reality down to 3, that then means that you can play with hue and chroma a little bit more. And I show that in my video. The more and more simple and crude you make the value plan, almost like a design poster, that then allows you to add more chroma and saturation because you're creating unity in one element and you're then it then allows the viewer to tolerate variety in another element.
Yeah, gotcha. And this is a perfect lead up to me showing this piece. It essentially is what you're saying. In a sense, I would think that this snow plane is essentially one value minus a
Yes.
couple things,
Yeah.
but you have one, two, three,
Right.
four,
Yeah.
six different hues within it,
Right.
arguably the same thing for the trees, right? So I guess in a sense, this is what you're alluding to,
Think,
correct?
yeah, absolutely. And it's a great tool for dealing with foregrounds in particular, like where you want to keep that bigger shape of the foreground quite calm. If you imagine that foreground broken up with as much level of information as those background trees, all of it would feel very busy. Like it's really necessary to have that calm, flat shape of a foreground in this piece. But within it, if I keep the value the same, I can get variety of hue and chroma.
Yeah, and that's where you get it, that variety
Yeah.
part of it. Yeah, interesting. That's
I love
great.
your analysis of my paintings. I'm just going to start sending you critique to help me out.
Oh, that's hilarious. Uh, and so the last question before we get to the final two questions, I want to pick your brain about your sketching with the marker. Some people call them notans. I don't want to
Mm,
pigeonhole that in a sense, but I was listening to one of your previous interviews, and we always talk about when you do one sketch, it leads to another question, it leads to another sketch, etc. However, you made it quite interesting in terms of your first sketch could be all about shape, and then that'll lead to another sketch that you alter the shape to see how that moves
right,
through. But then
right.
you're to move forward, you don't have to continue with shape. You could do another sketch just based on value,
Good.
etc. And then
Yeah,
you can marry those. And I thought that was so refreshing that your entire design doesn't rely on this one sketch. It relies on the idea and the process through those sketches. Can you
right.
talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and I think as I get more experienced and maturer, shall we say, there's so much emphasis in teaching on method and process. And I think with this video, more than anything, I want to emphasize that the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more approaches, the more ways in that you have, then you can adapt the method to suit the concept. And that is, it's huge. For one thing, it creates variety in your working practice, which keeps things fresh. Just through those sketches, yes, exploring different ways in, different ways of analyzing, is imposing a design structure, as you say, based on value, gonna help me out the most, or is doing a notan where I'm simply looking at lights and darks going to help me out the most, or as in the example I showed, simple contour drawings. If it's a front lit scene and I don't have many darks to organize, it's really just the shapes of color, then a contour. So my sketchbook is full of like different ways in, even with the same tool of a Sharpie pen. It's different ways of analyzing the same thing.
Yeah, and I think that's wonderful. And I hope people hear that when they watch this video because sometimes people just see the sketch and they think that's what it is. It isn't just that
Right.
sketch, it's everything that
No.
you're talking about. So that's
Yeah.
wonderful.
And the Sharpie thing actually came from Catherine Stats because I was a very, very reluctant sketchbook user. I saw so many sketchbooks where it was just like this beautiful graphite museum piece sketch. And I'm like, and it should be a place, your sketchbook should look really ugly. It should be where all the mistakes take place, right? Because you're sorting out all the things to avoid. And Catherine Stat, and I said to me, I just see these graphite sketches and, what's the point? Are you just replicating what's there? Like, is it a decision-making process? Is it an like I wanted my sketchbook to be a place of exploration. And I was always really self-conscious with how ugly they look. It is the place where you should get all the ugliness and you should be making decisions. And Kathleen Statt said to me, there is no hesitant mark making with a Sharpie pen. And I, well, too true, so it's been great for me because you feel that. And I see when students are drawing, if I give them a chance with pencil, it's all very, thinking, well, maybe I'll resolve it later. No, where do you want that tree to bisect the canvas? Tell me, where do you want it,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah. That's great to know that it was passed forward to you from Catherine
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
changed my way of working when Maria Josenhans passed it on to me. And she
Oh,
obviously, I think, got it from you. I can't speak for
right.
her, but I think
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
such a strong
yeah.
chain of events there. It
And
has to be, right?
now my alternative to that has been, because the downside of a Sharpie pen is, yes, there's no hesitant mark to be made, but you also can't erase a bad mark. which then means you start the sketch over again and over again. And so my substitute now for that has become a dry erase board. And I have like 6 of them in the studio. And I'm like, because it's as definite a mark, but if you want to make an adjustment, you just wipe through and do it again. And so I have like 6 dry erase boards around the studio, and that's kind of become my studio sketchbook.
That's such a great idea. Guess what I'm going out to buy today?
I know. I have. It all started, Michael, with me going around in workshops with a mini one, because when I'm trying to help students, sometimes the words don't flow eloquently. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh, let me draw a picture and explain myself. And so I was walking around the field and I was just like, well, this is the answer to the downside of using a Sharpie in the sketchbook, is just a dry erase board. Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's worth the price of admission right there.
Okay.
So we're at the end, but there's 2 questions I'd like to ask everybody, all right? Hopefully the answers can be different, although they're similar in a sense. What is your top piece of advice that you would give others?
That I would give others.
Yes.
It comes from my own personal experience, I guess, but I think a lot of us suffer the same curse. And it would be don't get in your own way. And I have done, and I've got gray hairs and sleepless nights, and I think I have, it's self-doubt and self-critiquing. There's a tipping point there where it can be really, really unhealthy. And I remember just almost paralyzing myself from doubting. Rather than seeing if something works, you start and you're already saying to yourself, is it working? Is it working? Is it working? Don't get in your own way. Once you get to the point where you realize that failures are part of the creative process and frustration is a constant feeling, I think I finally learned to give myself a bit of a break. There's a great new book out, well, relatively new, Rick Rubin, who's a music producer for Johnny
Oh,
Cash, a bunch
yeah,
of
that's right.
others.
He's produced like everybody, hasn't he?
Yeah, it's called A Creative Act, The Way of Being. And he comes from a music producing background, but it's a little like Robert Henry's The Art Spirit, but for the modern era. And a lot of it is about functioning as a creative person. And I tell you, I am a workaholic. I work hours that are way too long, to my own detriment. And I question myself too much. And if I've done a painting like today, I was like, I feel quite nauseous and anxious today. And I'm like, is that because I have an interview, or is that because I'm declaring a painting finished today? Like which one is giving me the greatest nausea? And it might be declaring a painting finished. It's just horrible. So much of this, the hard emotions to deal with. And the Rick Rubin book is really good at just saying, that is the curse of the creative mind, that we're always doubting ourselves. We always think, can we do this better? Is just to not judge yourself, not make comparisons with others, but just to say, did you show up to work today without making excuses? Yes, I did. Did you give it your best shot? Yes, I did. Okay. Go and get a good 8 hours sleep. Don't be angsting at 2 a.m. Can I do it better? Can I do it better? I'm worthless. I'm worthless. So that would be my advice. Don't get in your own way.
That's great. That's great. It seems like I need to add that checklist at the studio door, so when you're walking out, you can just say yes to both and be happy, right?
It's only now that I'm better at walking away at the end of the day.
That's great.
Maybe I
Fantastic.
sneak back after dinner and take one. I do tend to do that, but I don't stay awake at 2 a.m., 4 a.m., just beating myself up for not being good enough. It's a pointless energy user.
Thank you for
Yeah.
that. Now, like I said, this is somewhat relatable, but what's the best piece of advice that you've been given?
I would have to credit Skip Wickham for that, in that the very first workshop I took from him, which is probably 15 years ago now, he got me to use a sketchbook, and I was all about being a plein air addict. I was all about the excitement of jumping in and getting into the juicy coloring in part. And I was so not about the prep work. And now I've become, such an advocate that a little bit of prep and planning will improve your work tenfold, give it 10 minutes, 10 times better than it would be without any. But I remember in the first workshop where he said, you can't start painting yet. I want to see a page of what ifs in your sketchbook. And I hated him for it at the time, you know, but that was probably the best advice yeah, for
That's
sure.
fantastic. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
it
And
opened up such a new world of knowing that the fun is in the learning part and the creativity is in the thinking part. It's not actually, true creativity. And in my video, of course, they would pull out that catchphrase that the creativity lies in the thinking, not the painting, and the painting is just coloring in. It's a very crude way of putting it, but I think that's probably true.
well, I think that's very accurate. Yeah, the more you paint, the more you realize that for sure. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, if you want to learn more about Jill, you can go onto her website, jillcarver.com. And of course, you can follow on Instagram at Jill Carver Paintings as well as her handle. So I do want to say thank you very much. I really appreciated this conversation. I could take it for another hour, but we both have things to do. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're very good at what you do, and I appreciate you being here for
Oh,
sure.
I
Yeah.
oh I
I
appreciate those
hope
kind words.
everyone got something out of it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. To be able to rewatch it as much as they want soon. So,
Okay,
all right. Thank
great.
you very much, everyone. And thank you
Thanks
very
so
much,
much,
Jill.
Mike.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.